and that therefore my claim would be that one could have an attractive functioning society in which there was no organization that had that characteristic. Now, a different question is in what sense, how much like a state would my system look? And I don't see any particular reason why you would end up with any unitary system. That it seems to me you've got a network of contracts that if you think about, say, think about the difference between our institutions producing food and the institutions producing food under Stalin. Our institution producing food, presumably, if you think of any farmer in any grocery store, you could connect the two by, 4 or 5 steps of contracts, right? The farmer sells to the wholesaler, who also sells to the grocery store. The farmer sells to the wholesaler, who sells to this grocery store, who buys from that wholesaler, who sells to this grocery store, and so forth. So that if you think of the ordinary market situation, you've got a nexus, a network of contracts linking everybody in the industry. And yet the result is radically different from what you have when the government actually runs agriculture. And of course, going back to this question of equality and inequality, it was when the government ran agriculture that several million Ukrainians starved because Stalin decided they didn't need to eat for various political reasons. And that's something which you're very unlikely to get in a market situation. And going back to the context of rights enforcement is very valuable. And as a general rule, it is worth more to me to have my rights enforced than to you to violate my rights. And thus, as a general rule, you're going to get an equilibrium on the market in which people get to enforce rights and rarely get to violate them. And unfortunately, that's not the equilibrium we observe on the political market, where, as we all know from Kelo and lots of other cases, if you have enough political influence, you can violate rights with impunity. And then, of course, the big difference between public police and private police is that when public police murder people, they don't go to jail.
Well, I guess what I was trying to get across is, do you think that STEP, private security firm A, for example, owns a particular geographic, or not even necessarily geographic, but in all likelihoods, I would think one of the things that's going to evolve is a homeowners association is going to choose to contract with private security firm A, and if you buy within that geographic area, the homeowners association.
It's a very small geographic area,
but
sure.
You're going to go with private security firm A.
Certainly possible.
Do you think it steps over the bound into something else when it essentially taxes the house next to that limited geographic area?
When the individual customer doesn't have the option of saying, I'll do business with somebody else and won't pay you. No, the question of what the equilibrium is an interesting one. And the part of it that I've actually thought about more is whether you're going to get natural monopoly. That if you suppose you end up with only 3 rights enforcement agencies in the current U.S., it's going to be very tempting for them to say, look, robbery is more profitable than business, let's become a government. Let's form a cartel, the 3 of us will join, and now customers don't get to leave. And whether that happens, I think, is going to be largely depend on what the economies of scale are in the industry, as in other industries. If you end up with an equilibrium with 100 or 200 firms, it's going to be very hard to pull off that cartel, because when you start trying to do it, your customers call up one of the firms, not that I know that we'd like some protection, please. But if you end up with 2 or 3 firms, then I think it's quite likely to be an unstable situation. And I've discussed that in various places. We'll discuss it more when I do another edition of Machinery of Freedom, because I thought about it more since I wrote.
Would you count on risk pooling or contractual law to respond to big events? Like if you have these private security companies that protect like a school or a neighborhood, say like there's a wildfire in California, how are you going to handle that? You expect these companies to make deals with one another?
You would expect that, sure. And similarly, I expect that there are going to be some cases where Company A, in investigating a burglary against its customer, gets evidence that the burglar stole from Company B's customer. They're probably going to have agreements for information sharing that, either formal agreements or informal agreements that, will talk to each other and so forth. It's in both companies' interest to do that. So I would expect that you see quite a lot of that happen.
I had a question about how prisons would work, and maybe you've dealt with it in your book, but I mean, it seems to me there's not a ton of market rationality to the cost of maintaining a prison for somebody, unless, do you envision just private prisons?
This gets into a different issue, but an interesting and important one about the nature of punishment. I actually have an old Journal of Political Economy article on the inefficiency of efficient punishments. That my initial instinct in this, and the one which I was arguing when I originally wrote the book, is that you want so far as possible to shift from punishments to fines of one sort. And if people can't pay fines, you make them work off the fines. So you have some sort of indentured servitude, in some ways that's a very attractive system. The problem with that system, I don't believe it would be as big a problem in a private one, but the problem in the modern world is that it then makes it profitable to convict people. And that if you want to do law and econ properly, you want to not only assume that criminals and victims are rational, you want to assume that cops and judges are rational too. And you then have the danger that if I can convict you of a crime, I can expropriate your human capital, and you then set off sort of a rent-seeking struggle. When I was originally used to be making this argument a long time ago, and so in an online discussion probably 15 years ago, somebody said, yeah, the European colonial powers in Africa had this system. When they wanted a road built, they would find some excuse to arrest a bunch of people, and then their punishment would be working on the road. And it then occurred to me that H.L. Mencken, who's a writer who everybody should read because he's a lot of fun, but most people don't, has a story about some local sheriff who liked to have his jail in good condition. And so once a year he would say to his deputies, all right, go out to the bars and get me one carpenter, one painter, and one plumber. And they go out, in a bar you can find an excuse to arrest somebody. They lock him up for 2 or 3 days while they fix up his jail for him and then turn him loose. And that's a less unpleasant version of the same story. So you do have the argument that on the one hand, there's much to be said for a system where punishment, so far as possible, are fines. You can recompense the victim. You can don't have to pay for jails and such. But on the other hand, you want to worry a bit about legal systems where there's too much of a temptation to profit by arrest. There's a science fiction series, by the way, by Larry Niven, who's a very bright guy, which raises this in the issue of organ forfeiture. That if you think about it, it really seems crazy that when you have somebody executed for a capital crime, you just bury him. After all, execution is the ideal circumstance for getting organs for transplant, right? The guy hasn't been messed up by being run over by a car or anything. And so Niven runs through this hypothetical future in which one country after another sees the logic of this and says, all right, when somebody's executed for a capital crime, his organs forfeit to the state for transplant. But of course, the next thing that happens, since there's still an organ shortage, is that there's pressure to expand the range of capital crimes. Because after all, maybe we don't really want to execute him. We think we can save 2 lives by doing it. And you finally discover in the short story where he originally introduces this, that the protagonist who is in prison awaiting execution, what he's been convicted of is for the 3rd time driving in such a way as to endanger human life. So 3 dangerous driving convictions, and it's 3 strikes and you're out. So I thought it was very, Niven wrote that I think before I published my article, and I discovered it afterwards. But it was neat that he had seen the logical problem with efficient punishment. Yeah. Yes?
Do you think that, I guess, to a certain extent, that the evolution of, like, geopolitical scope kind of would prevent the de-evolution of the state, as it were? I mean, I guess, rationally speaking, between all 308 million of us as Americans, we would be concerned now with a general lessening of military might for fear of an invasion for another country that chooses not to go down an anarchical path. And I'm not asking you to solve geopolitical problems.
In Machinery of Freedom, the chapter on national defense was entitled National Defense, the Hard Problem. And the reason it's a hard problem is that it is first a public good in the economist sense, that is a good where if I produce it, I can't control who gets it, and a public good whose lack can be catastrophic. So that I would have said that most of the things called public goods, it's dubious that the government improves it. There's somebody who looked at the question of the effect on scientific progress of government investment in scientific progress and concluded it was 0. That is, that if you looked at areas where there was a sudden shift towards large-scale government subsidy, you did not see a resulting increase in progress. In my view, probably the existence of the public school system results in Americans being less well-educated than they would otherwise be, not more. We can go into that in more detail. So I think most of those things, many of the things government does, law and war on drugs say, would be much better off without. Some of the things government does, there is some benefit to, but I suspect not enough to make up for the cost. National defense is the hardest one, because you can't defend yourself against somebody else's government. And I've got further thoughts on how you might do it, but again, that would take us beyond this.
All right, with that, we will conclude this event. Please join me in giving a round of applause.